Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Kevin Talek Marston, and it's my pleasure as president of the Society for American Soccer History, also known as SASH, to welcome you to our December 2024 First Friday session, the final one of this year. Founded in 1993, SASH works to promote, facilitate, and disseminate research into the rich history and heritage of soccer in the United States. You can find us best at two places: on the web at ussoccerhistory.org and on social media with our Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn accounts. Please follow the First Friday sessions using a hashtag FFSS, and post about them so that Dan Creel can retweet from our SASH account. A reminder that the SASH website, which is maintained by Ed Farnsworth, has many excellent resources. So if you miss this session, then you may also be able to listen to it, because all prior sessions and this one have been turned into podcasts thanks to Brian Korstadt. So thanks to our entire volunteer membership for managing all of this. Are you working on anything that you might like to present at a future SASH session on Friday? Then please reach out to the board. All ideas are welcome from current and future members. If a shorter format would be of interest to you or to float some ideas, then we can also order shorter sessions with several speakers. And if writing if writing is more your thing than speaking, then please reach out to us about submitting written contributions for the SASH website. And if you're not yet a member, you can join SASH through our website. We welcome new members with open arms and friendly feet. So please visit the website and click on the Join SASH tab up at the top, so you'll be eligible to receive our regular newsletter, which is so aptly put together by Brian Bunk. I will pass the floor over to Eero Salkeld, who has taken the time to imagine and prepare this session, and he will chair things today. And I think we're all very excited about this session. Thank you very much, Eero. It's over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for joining us for the oral history workshop. And I would like to introduce Dr. Carly Adams, who is a Board of Governors Research Chair, Tier 1, Director of the Center for Oral History and Tradition, and Professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Physical Education at the University of Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada, who will be doing the presentation today. Thank you, Carly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for having me today. Thank you for the kind introduction, Eero. It's delightful to be part of your organization and also to hear more. So thank you, Kevin, for sharing some of that at the beginning so I could hear more about what your organization is all about as well. I'm here today to talk about doing oral history, something that I'm very passionate about, that I'm an advocate for. And as Eero said, I'm a professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Physical Education at the University of Lethbridge in southern Alberta. The city of Lethbridge, where I'm located, is in southern Alberta on the lands of the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future. And as someone living, working, and raising my family and benefiting from Blackfoot Confederacy territory, I acknowledge, respect, and deeply appreciate the traditions and cultural heritage of the people who have cared for this land since time immemorial. And as a guest on Blackfoot territory, I acknowledge my responsibilities as I continually learn and unlearn, and as I try through my research and teaching to reckon with the silences and erasures that are perpetuated through our colonial histories. At the University of Lethbridge,
Carly, you're actually muted. Sorry.
Thank you. I seem to have clicked something there. There we go. Thanks, James. I'm also the director for the Center for Oral History and Tradition at our university, and this center brings together a number of us across many different subject areas, including history, sociology, kinesiology, women and gender studies, Indigenous studies, and anthropology. And through the center, we host a number of workshops every year, a speaker series, we fund a few small research grants, and we host an oral history summer workshop, a 6-week virtual workshop every May and June that anyone from around the world can join in. We usually get about 70 people each spring, and we bring in a whole slate of really exciting guest speakers. So if anyone's interested about that, we can talk more about that later as well. So I'm really excited to be here. I hope that you're excited as well to learn a little bit more on this oral history journey today. I began my training as an oral historian in 2001 when I was in graduate school at Western University, then the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, in central Canada. And in my work and the research that I still do now, I'm most interested in speaking to people about their sport and physical activity experiences to learn about the hows and the why. I'm curious about how people explain, how they rationalize, how they make sense of their sport experiences within the context of their lives. What does it mean to them? What barriers did they face, perhaps, and in some cases overcome? How did these challenges or success and triumphs impact their lives more generally? And also, what did these experiences mean in the context of the social, cultural, economic, political moments of the era that I'm looking at? So it's in these moments of the everyday that really interest me. It's about relationships, the emotions, and the hows and whys of people's lives and their actions through sport and recreation. So I want to start our discussion today about thinking about the value and purpose of oral history for those of you who are not familiar. And so I have a couple of questions just to get you thinking about this. So if you could just, I can see many of you on the screen. If you can raise your hand, no need to participate if you don't want to, but I want you to think through some questions. So who here keeps a diary, a handwritten diary that you still write into? Okay. How many of you write a letter at least once a week? It can be typed, but I want it to be something that you put in the mail with a stamp, although we have a Canada Post strike on right now, so none of that's happening here at the moment. But how many of you actually send mail by post still? Not very many of us. How many of you read a hard copy of a newspaper, not something online or scrolling through our phones? Do you still read hard copies of newspapers? Okay, a few people. Do you know somebody who's in their 20s? Perhaps your child, or a student that you know who reads a hard copy of a newspaper? No. So few people are doing this these days. So I ask you these questions to get you thinking about the way that our historical sources have changed over the last 2 decades, with an increasing resilience and importance on social media, right? The internet, Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever the hot I said Twitter. Sorry, that should have been X, I suppose. I'm not even sure if that's still around. Everyone seems to be leaving it. Anyway, online newspapers and magazines, right? We're bombarded with all of these things these days. And it's very rare for us these days to have handwritten letters, handwritten correspondence with a close friend, to keep a diary, to correspond with someone through the post from another country, to write and send an actual Christmas card. Although I have started doing that again in the last 5 years, I realized how much I missed it. So I now send out about 60 Christmas cards again through the mail. Print newspapers, we know, are struggling to remain alive, and who knows if they're even going to exist in the next decade. And what this means is that we're not producing and keeping sources of information that we count on as historians in the same way. And this is, of course, becoming a real issue to how we do our work. And so for me, this means that oral history is even more important. And oral history as a practice, as a field of study, as a discipline, is not new. And it's gone through many cycles of popularity and respectability and less popularity and respectability over time, depending on which particular culture we're talking about. But I would say that we're at a historic high right now for valuing oral history work within the field of history and beyond. Although I have to also have a caveat here that oral history work and oral traditions and storytelling have been around for a long, long time. And so Indigenous peoples, for example, have always had a high respect for and grounding in the transmission of knowledge and oral stories. On the land that we now call Canada and around the world, Indigenous peoples rely on oral transmission of stories, lessons, other knowledge to maintain a historical record and sustain their culture and identities. But Western discourse, of course, prioritizes the written word as the dominant form of record keeping, until maybe relatively recently. Euro-North Americans have generally considered oral societies to be people without histories. But this, of course, couldn't be further from the truth. And it's taken a long time to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have an established and a long record of oral history. Even our courts of law had to be convinced. So I have a court case for you on the screen here. In the last 20 years or so, the use of oral histories as evidence in the court of law has become a topic of much conversation and debate here in Canada, where I am. Perhaps the most famous case of oral histories in a legal context is from 1997. And this is a case from the province of British Columbia on the West Coast. And this case eventually went to the Supreme Court. So on behalf of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en peoples, a man named Delmaguk sued the provincial government for extinguishing land rights in the absence of a treaty. And the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en peoples argued that they had title to the lands in British Columbia that made up their traditional territories. And in order to prove this, they were asked to provide evidence that they had occupied their territories for thousands of years. Without written documents to make their case, chiefs presented their oral histories in the form of narratives, storytelling, dance, speeches, and songs. Their testimony, however, was not well received, and Justice Alan McEachran concluded that this evidence had no weight. And in his now infamous ruling, he concluded that the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en's ancestors were a people without culture who had no written language. That's quoted from his brief. And he even cited 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes to support his views. But the case did not end there, thankfully. And on appeal, the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'ens won a precedent-setting victory for oral history to be given weight as legal evidence. So while the Supreme Court did not make a definitive ruling on land rights in this case, monumental precedents were set here, including that First Nations oral histories were admissible evidence, deemed equal or of greater value than written evidence. And Chief Justice Antonio Lorimer ruled that oral history is admissible as evidence and that the way the lower courts have been approaching oral history in the past was inadequate. And this was a huge moment for First Nation communities and for the appreciation of oral culture in Canada, but we still feel the impact of this as well in our oral history work. So oral history as a field of study, as a way of doing research, took a lot of criticism in the 1960s, 70s, into the 80s. And the criticism at the time was, how can we really believe one person's account? How can I believe what one person is telling me, what their experiences are? Isn't it just their subjective perspective? But this had a real shift in the 1980s when the so-called hierarchy of sources was questioned. Maybe you remember some of these scholarly debates that took place. And this idea was really thrown out on the basis in general agreement that all sources are biased. And as oral historians, we argue exactly that it is the subjectivity of somebody's experience that provides such a rich and important source of information. Having an interviewee tell us about their interpretation of their everyday life or their experiences from their perspective is exactly what we're looking for. So it's pretty rare today not to value oral history for what it is and for its strengths. And we're seeing a lot more oral history work done. One of the early advocates for oral history, Alessandro Portelli, who was actually one of our guest speakers at our Oral History Summer Institute 2 years ago, he says it like this: oral sources tell us not just what people did, but what they wanted to do and what they believed. So oral history is a method of collecting historical information. Oral histories record remembrances from individuals who were involved in or who witnessed past events, and they offer us new insights and information that's not available through our written sources. And as I mentioned before, as a society, we're creating a lot less written records that can be passed down from generation to generation. I always have this fear that the cloud is just going to disappear and everything we've stored on it is going to vaporize. And I actually heard someone speaking about this on the CBC radio last week. I was like, oh my goodness, can't even imagine, because so much would just be gone. So the oral history interview is another way that we can understand the past and get greater insight into what it is that we're researching. Historian Paul Thompson argues that oral narratives serve as a link between the personal experiences of the individual and the wider social history of which they were a part. So they can tell us more, they can tell us what people wanted to do, how they felt, what they experienced in a way that no other source can. Oral history lets us hear from people as well who are not usually represented in mainstream sources, people who are sometimes not considered important. You may have heard the cynical phrase, of course, that history is written by the winners. Well, there's some truth to that in terms of who gets to control and preserve the materials in the archives, right? We need to be thinking about what's actually saved in archives and in museums and how those decisions get made about what gets included and what doesn't. In recent years, the discipline of history, I would argue, has shifted from narrowly defining important people to focus on histories of groups who have traditionally been marginalized. And of course, we refer to this as histories from the bottom up. And this is often what we see in our sport history research as well. Because many groups are often poorly represented in traditional historical sources like newspapers, diaries that get kept, or correspondence, oral history is really crucial for capturing their histories. And it's very powerful for interpreting and sharing their understanding and perspectives of the events that they were participating in. So by entrusting me with their stories, the people that I interview have given me the responsibility of presenting and interpreting their lives within our understandings of our historical context that we're looking at. Each person's story is unique, it's telling, and it's personal. And they understand and share and remember their stories within the context of their present, right? And this is something really important to think about. Often we're asking someone to think back 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, but they're doing that through their present lens of where they are today in the world and how those memories have stayed with them over a period of time. My work as an oral historian, and I would argue everyone doing this work, is also about who we are as researchers, how we negotiate the world, our own subject positions and identity, what we bring into the interview that we are doing. I'm not a faceless, objective interviewer, and I challenge anyone who says that they are. At the center of oral history work is our relationships, right? This work is very complicated. It takes a lot of time, which we'll get into in a minute. And it is about developing rapport and creating relationships with the people that we're interacting with and we're asking to share their stories with us. So we are connecting with people, we make relationships, we sometimes disclose ourselves to others. We need to decide how we're going to interview someone. Is it going to be a conversation where we're sharing our perspective and who we are as part of that conversation? We have a lot of decisions to make. And always when we are doing this type of research, we're learning about ourselves as we're learning about others. So as historians, we become part of the meaning making as well. As part of our workshop today, Arrow asked me to provide an overview of the basics of conducting oral histories, while also diving deeper into how to make an oral history interview more conversational, how to bring out more analysis, and how to improvise rather than sticking to a script to only ask the participant predetermined questions. Arrow, I hope I've summarized what you asked me to do properly. So what I've done is I've pulled some slides from a beginner oral history workshop that we offer here, and I can share these as well to have them into your records for someone who's new and who's just starting to think about doing this type of research. This gives you sort of a basic overview of some of the things that you should be thinking about. So I'll just go through some of this, and then after I'm done going through this, what I want to do is have a bit of a discussion about what we do with our oral history work. What do we need? What do we want to do with it afterwards? And I want to share an example from one of the projects that I'm currently working on about how we're thinking about the dissemination of this work right up front at the beginning and how it's sort of guiding the principles of the research that we're doing. Okay. So planning your oral history project, there's many things that you need to think about. And in many ways, doing oral history work is much more time consuming. I often joke with my partner and colleagues that sometimes I just want to go back to the archives, right? Nobody can talk back to me. I'm dealing with boxes of newspapers, there's no relationships, right? Which is the exciting part of oral history, but also takes a ton of time to be able to negotiate, and it's exhausting. Okay, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So when you're planning your oral history project, you want to be thinking about the goals of the project. And this is what I want to share when I talk through the dissemination piece for a project that I'm currently working on. What is your goal of the project? What do you want to do with this afterwards? You need to determine the scope of the project. How many people are you hoping to interview? Is this going to be a long-term project over 5, 10 years, or is it something that's much shorter? So there are some decisions to be made about this. And then, of course, conducting primary research, as we all do with our projects, and determining who's going to work on the project and what type of training is needed, right? Often it is a one-person endeavor where we're doing this on our own. But my projects most lately have become much larger than that. They're very collaborative. This work is often very collaborative. I have a number of students, as many as 10 sometimes, undergrad and graduate students, working with me on various aspects of this as projects morph and go in different directions. So it's important to think about who will be working on the project and what part they'll play. Then, of course, you're determining who's going to be interviewed and how to gain access to those people. And then what's going to happen to the recordings and the materials that you're collecting when the project comes to the end. And I just had a meeting yesterday with our archives here on campus to talk through some of those ideas, because there's a whole digitization project here on campus to think through how we can start to document and preserve and archive our oral history interviews so that they're not just sitting on somebody's computer kept away from the public. Ethics is a huge part of what we do here in Canada. Working at a university, I need to go through a research ethics board before I speak with anyone and submit a complete report, have it reviewed and feedback provided, and then get permission and protocols in place in order to do this oral history work. I know that looks different at some institutions in the US and also at different places around the world, but it's important to think about your ethical obligations and how you're going to be very clear with people about the consent that they're giving to speak with you and share their stories. What I have in the third column here is determining sort of the nuts and bolts of doing this. What equipment do you need? What supplies? What other resources? Do you have everything, the recorder that you're going to use, available to you? And then, of course, developing a timeline for the project. This is really important to do, and I will say that often it's hard to stick to the timeline that you might create. But creating a timeline so that everyone is aware of what this looks like, and so you have a sense of what you can devote to this. And of course, developing a budget. We often don't think about a budget for this type of work, but often you do need one. Is the community that you're working with, is there an expectation of gifting, for example? The equipment that you need to buy, depending on what you're going to do for dissemination after the fact, you may need some funds to do that. So those are some of the things to be thinking about up front. Just need to move my screen so I can see better. There we go. So when you're starting an oral history project, the first piece is initial contact. Clearly, you want to reach out to somebody, you need to develop rapport and create a relationship with people. And so you're outlining the purpose and nature of the interview when you're doing this, and the time that's required of someone, and also how the interview will be used and for what purposes. It's very important that you're upfront with people about what you're going to do with this down the road. Is it just going to be part, not just, but is it going to become part of an academic article you're writing, a newspaper article you're working on, or will it be more than that? Will it be available to the public through a museum exhibit? Will it be part of a popular book project? Will it be part of a digital storytelling project that you're creating? Schedule a time and place for both the interviewer and the interviewee, somewhere that's comfortable and safe for both of you. When I started doing this work years ago, I found myself going to farms in the middle of a rural area, and I had this moment where I was like, nobody knows where I am, and I don't know these people that I'm going to, right? So it's really important that you think through some of these pieces, and you talk about this if you have students who are doing this with you as well, about safety and comfort. I also have sound here. It's really important to think through the sound, especially as you're thinking through how you're going to disseminate this research. You want to make sure I've done interviews in a Starbucks with a barista beside me that's been very noisy and loud, and going back and transcribing those is really, really difficult after the fact. So you want to make sure that you're in an environment where the sound is quiet and calm and conducive to what you're doing. I have some other things on here. Conduct a background, your background research, of course. Prepare your list of questions beforehand. Now, there's varying philosophies on this. Some people do go in with a very structured list of questions, and I always recommend doing that if for no other reason than, often we get anxious and nervous doing this type of work, and you don't know what's going to happen during an interview. Every single interview is different. And so it is a good idea to have some sort of list of questions, but sometimes you won't rely on those, right? You want to think about what type of interview you want to be doing and what you want this to look like. And often it is much more conversational, that you're meeting with someone and it's a much more co-created conversation between the two of you that flows back and forth. And you want to be really open to pivoting. You might go in with your structured questions, knowing exactly what you want to talk about, and your interviewee might have a very different idea of what it is they want to share and what histories are important to them. And so it's really important that you honor that and you be open to pivoting and to listening, because there's a reason why, right? They're taking the interview in a specific direction. Also, test your equipment beforehand. There's nothing worse than doing an interview and finding out that it's completely disappeared. In terms of informed consent, just to come back to this for a minute, it's really important that people know that doing oral history work, participating in an interview, is completely voluntary. The interviewee needs to have a full understanding of the research, its implications, its potential risks and outputs. And there should be a consent form, right? As a university researcher, I am required to have a consent form that's approved through my research ethics board. But any oral history project should have a consent form where the interviewee has something in writing that you go through and they thoroughly understand exactly what's going on. Also, we need to be recognizing that sometimes our interviewees are going to place restrictions on the work that we're doing in ways that might be surprising to you at times. Someone might say to you in the middle of an interview, "I'm happy for you to talk to me about when I played soccer, in this case, ice hockey, in terms of some of the research I'm doing right now in the 1970s, but I don't want you to use this until my husband's passed away or until my grandmother is no longer around or until I'm not here, maybe." There might be some sort of stipulation or embargo that somebody puts on that has real impacts on the research that we're doing. The standard practice in oral history work is for interviewees to be identified by name. So what we're trying to do with oral history work is to enter someone into a historical record that's been absent, right? That wasn't there before. So this is unusual from other forms of interviewing where we often, we have a sample size of 30 or 40 and we want to keep everyone anonymous. But with oral history interviews, we really want to be honoring who they are and having their name enter into the historical record. Of course, there might be some circumstances where this isn't the case and where someone asks to be anonymous, and that's something, of course, to be thinking about. So I have some quick slides here that I'll go through, just things to think about before you go out to do an interview. Make sure you have extra supplies, extra batteries if you're doing a recorder, a backup recorder like your cell phone. It's also important because there's always going to be someone who says, "Oh, I've got this box of things in my closet, a whole box of photographs that I want to show you, or these great documents from the organization that you're asking me about. Let me go get them for you." And so it's really important to have a camera that you can snap some quick pictures with their consent, of course. Years ago, I used to actually bring a scanner and hook it up to my laptop and do some scanning there on the spot. And it's also really important to bring a journal and to keep track of any information that's not recorded. When we're doing an oral history interview, we're either recording it, video recording it, or doing it as an audio recording. And if it's an audio recording, you don't have eyes, right? You don't have visual there. And oral history interviews are about more than what's being said. It's about how someone's reacting in that moment, what their bodily comportment's about, how they're interacting with you and what's going on in that space. They may say, oh, let me show you this picture, right? And of course, you don't have access to that through an audio recording. A few other things just to be thinking about, positioning the recorder somewhere that's easy to capture both voices, doing some testing beforehand. There's a lot of things to be thinking about as you set up something like this. Run a test of your recorder. Be willing to turn it off. If, there are many cases where an interviewee will say to you, I'd love to share this story with you, but I really don't want it on the recording. I'd like it off the record. So of course you're turning off your recorder at that point and probably hearing some great things that you won't be able to use in your research. In terms of questions, I'll just spend a couple of minutes here. Start with a question that puts people at ease. So again, this should be something very conversational. And know which questions you want to ask are key, but don't be tied, right, to a specific list of questions. It's really, really easy for us to have our own agendas as researchers that we go into an interview thinking, okay, this is what I want to find out. And for the interviewee, as I said, to have a very different agenda. And it's really important to be able to actively listen, right? And this is a skill that gets developed over time. It's not easy to be an active listener and to be in the moment and present when you're also thinking about everything else, right? Jotting down those notes about what they said, trying to think about what they're telling you and how it fits within the broader histories as you understand them, trying to think about the questions that you want to ask. There's lots going on in the moment of an interview. It's also really important to allow silences, to let somebody think about the answer that they want to share and to let, and it's silences can be uncomfortable sometimes, but they're also really productive. All right, so I've got some other things on here. Don't interrupt the interviewee, some things like that. Also be sensitive of the needs of the interviewer. Doing this type of work is exhausting for both the interviewee and the interviewer. You will be exhausted at the end of this, even if it's a short interview. I suggest that 1 to 2 hours is more than enough time, especially, if you have somebody that you're working with who's older. Just watch to make sure they're not getting too tired. And if they are, of course, stop the interview, schedule another session. People are often more than willing for you to come back to it. At the end of the interview, check that you have everything that you need, that all of the letters of consent have been signed, you have the correct spelling of things that they told you. If you want to go back and check things, make sure that you're thanking them. This is a really special thing that somebody is giving you their time to talk about their experiences and to share their lives with you in this way. We're coming into somebody's life in a very personal way by doing oral history work. And so it's really important to thank them at the end. And then after the interview, it's super important to right away be sitting down and making some notes, thinking about what's happened in that space, what types of things you talked about, what might not have been on the recording. As we move away in time from this moment, it's really difficult sometimes to come back and remember what was actually happening. So I often sit down for a half an hour or an hour and think through exactly what happened in that space. Also, do something to protect your recording right away. Download it off your device, put it somewhere safely, copy it, put it in a secure location. All right, I'm going to skip through here. Also make an arrangement with a public archive so that you have a spot to be putting your oral history interviews, whether it's the transcript or an interview or something with more metadata where people can actually search the interview. Lots of archives these days are more than willing to do that, and it's really nice to have those available for future researchers down the road. All right. So after all of that, let me jump in for a few minutes and then we'll open the floor for discussion to talk about some of the research that I've been doing through a project called the Nikkei Memory Capture Project. This is a project that I'm working on with Dr. Darren Aoki at the University of Plymouth in the UK. This is a picture of him in the center there and some of our research students here on the right. And this is an oral history project that initiates the narration and analysis of the social and cultural histories of Japanese Canadians from 1950 to the present here in Southern Alberta. So far, we've interviewed over 150 people as part of this project. We've collected hours of interviews to record for the first time experiences of Japanese Canadians here during the Second World War, after the Second World War, sorry, a period when Nikkei's lives and communities here in Southern Alberta were destroyed during the Second World War by state-directed racist persecution as people were moved from the west coast of Canada to Southern Alberta. So this project is focusing on what happened after the war to get people to think about, what do their everyday lives look like as they were rebuilding their lives post-World War II. And as part of this, of course, we're looking at a number of different things, including sport and physical activity cultures. We've done projects looking at the histories of curling within the community, baseball, Japanese dancing. My most recent project is on the role of ice hockey in Japanese Canadian families. I haven't looked at soccer yet. Soccer hasn't come up a lot yet, but I'm going to have to dig down there too. So one of our key aims with the Nikkei Memory Capture Project, thinking back to the goal of a project that you might set up, is to return the stories back to the community. And it's been really important to think about how we can do that in a way that's accessible to the Japanese Canadian community, in a way that they want them returned, and how they can be returned more broadly as well. So we're always thinking about, what are we going to do with this? What's the purpose of this engagement? Is it about creating an oral history database? Are you wanting to develop a documentary film? Is it about working with a museum to return those stories in some way? It might be all of those things. So for us, we're concentrating on collaboration and co-creation within the community, figuring out a way to return the stories. And in 2019, we had this really unique opportunity to work with the Nikkei Japanese Garden here in Lethbridge. And they were developing this new cultural center, the Bunka Center that you see on the screen here. These are some pictures of the garden right here. And we were approached to help with some exhibits that they were wanting to develop to bring more histories about Japanese Canadians into this space. And so we ended up over the last 3 years developing 4 different exhibits. We developed a memory booth, a time map, an audio journey experience, and an interactive experience about historical racism. And the oral history work that we've done, all 150 interviews, are incorporated into those exhibits in some way. So this, for example, is a time map that is on the main wall in the Bunka Center that we created, that talks about the waves of migrations of Japanese Canadians into and out of Southern Alberta. But then as part of this, we also layered on an audio journey. And there are hundreds of clips now in this audio journey that range anywhere between 2 to 10 minutes long, that incorporate the archival work that we've done, but also bring the voices of the people that we've been interviewed into these spaces as well. So through the audio journey, people can hear about cultural activities, food in daily life, sporting leagues and competitions that Nikkei families were involved in, religion, business innovations, and different transformations that happened within Japanese Canadian society. Here's one quote with Hollis Pickerel, one of our interviewees, where she talks about curling with her family and how it was such an important intergenerational activity. She says, there's a bit of competitiveness, but it's about the family getting together. I curl with my dad and my nieces. It's not about winning. It's about the granddaughter curling with the uncle and the grandpa. It's fun. It's something to do together. So we're incorporating these stories as part of these exhibits. This is a picture of the latest one that we did, which is on a tablet in the museum. It's an interactive exhibit where people can flip through, and there's oral history pieces as part of this museum exhibit as well. This is the memory booth. So this is a small booth that we installed within the Bunka Center. It has a piece of software in it where Darren and I were turned into cartoon characters to narrate some of this. And as part of this, people can go in and watch short films that we created, short digital storytelling films, and I'll share one of those with you in a moment. They're films that are between 3 and 6 minutes, and someone can sit and watch them. But there's also a recording feature in the booth, and this is my favorite part of this, is that somebody can go in and share their experience of being in the garden, or also share a clip from their, a story from their family history. And then we can go back to them later to do a more in-depth interview. So the recordings that are left are then becoming part of our research. All right. So I don't want to take up too much more time, because I want to make sure before we get to 1 o'clock that we have time for discussion and any questions that you might have and direction you want to go. So I'll just share one of our digital storytelling films with you. This is Pat Sassa. In 2001, Darren and I trained through the Story Center in Berkeley, California, and we've done a number of training sessions now to become facilitators of oral digital storytelling work. And what we were really interested in was how could we take the oral history work that we were doing and think about blending it with digital storytelling methodology and also education, right? Thinking about pedagogy and how to bring some of these stories back to the community. And so far we've developed 14 different films that are available through the memory booth and on our website. And this is one of the first ones that we did with Pat Sassa. Pat decided every interviewee gets to decide what their story is going to be about, drawing on the philosophy of digital storytelling. This is complicated sometimes when you want them to tell a very particular story and they say, oh, no, I want to talk about this instead. Okay. But everything is done by the participant. So in this film, Pat has narrated the story. She's written the story. She's picked all of the video footage, all of the images, the direction of it. She's directed it all. So this is her story and how she wanted to give it back to the community. All right, let's hope this works. This is just a few minutes long.
It was a red kimono with white flowers that was made by my mother. I was about 8 years old, and this was my first solo performance, which would unknowingly begin my journey to classical and folk dance. Little did I realize that 70 years later, I would invite others to learn, practice, and preserve this beautiful cultural art with me. I remember carefully watching my first instructor, Sensei Kimura-san. Her movements were so precise and graceful. I wanted to be able to dance just like her. Years later, following secondary education, jobs, marriage, and raising a family, the Buddhist temple were extending invitations to all who wished to dance for Obon. It meant driving into Lethbridge from Tabor for weekly practices, but the calling overtook all excuses not to go. It felt wonderful to once again be part of a dance group. Eventually, I had the opportunity to learn classical dance with Momiji dancers under the instruction of the late Sensei Aya Hiranaka and our master Tatsumi Yoshikyo. I would slip into a kimono, engage in the art of properly tying an obi, learning the magic of using a sensu, positioning a flower in my hair, pull on my tabi and put my feet into my zori. Ouch! My big toe took some adjustment to the Y strap and heavy on that red lipstick. I was once asked what I experienced when entering on stage, when the audience became quiet and there was anticipation in the air. I am happy to have their attention and I want to do my very best. The group had no intention to perform, but invitations to publicly share what we practice each week evolved, and we are honored to show how much we enjoy to dance. Presently, we are grateful guests to be able to dance weekly during the summer months at the Nikkei Garden, during this pandemic year and all its restrictions. I still get butterflies and jitters. I still make mistakes, but I hope no one notices. There's always a bit of anxiety, but it's that anxiety that makes me want to strive for 110%. Dancing evokes many things for me, a calmness and peace within. It is healing for my soul. I am absorbed in the moment. I forget about the business of the day and what tomorrow may bring. Chasing my dream came in segments, and then unexpectedly, it is there in front of me. I've always wanted to dance, and I want others to dance with me. I dance for pure enjoyment and exercise. I dance for camaraderie and forever friendships. Come, dance with me and enjoy the graceful movements that honor the ancient art. In my next life, I will learn ballroom and line dancing.
So this is a way that we are returning the stories back to the community, and that the oral interviewees that we're working with can make decisions about what they want those stories to look like. So I will leave it there for now, and I welcome any questions or conversation or discussion that people would like to have.
Thank you, Carly, for that wonderful presentation. Looks like we do have 2 questions in the chat. First one is from James. What are the biggest hurdles when trying to conduct an oral history recording with an elder?
Can you see me there still? Sorry, I've lost this Zoom screen for some reason. I just wanted to put this screen up while we're talking. When you say elder, are you meaning an Indigenous elder or someone who's older?
Well, just older, who I
Someone
mean,
who's older.
based
Yeah.
on,
Yeah.
and maybe it's
Yeah.
very particular to Indigenous elder.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, no, there's lots of things to be thinking about as we're doing work with I'm just going to shut that screen down if that's okay. As we're doing work with older individuals is one, making sure that they're able to give informed consent for sure. And I'm curious if you have specific questions about what you mean about working with someone who's older, because there are many different things, but there are considerations with working with someone of any age. Something specific you're thinking of?
it's probably, maybe it depends on the subject and maybe what kind of traumatic experience that was for them, and do you really do a lot more preparation in terms of making sure that they're really comfortable, because you're caring for them in the physical sense in that space where you're doing it, but then there's also the psychological and that comfort as well.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And being open for them to have a family member there with them, which of course changes the dynamic of an interview sometimes, but it's very common for a grandchild or a son or daughter to want to sit through the interview and be part of it. And then you've got a very different interview dynamic that's taking place. But yes, it is often about the comfort of that person and meeting them where they're at. And, when we're talking about sport and physical activity, we often think about it as a positive experience, but those experiences intersect with everything else that's going on in our lives. And so it is often traumatic that people are talking about very difficult moments in their lives sometimes. It's not just about success and triumph. And so it is important to recognize that and make sure that there are community resources in place wherever you are, that if people do need help, we're not counselors as oral historians. We're not trained in those ways. And so making sure that there are, we can offer the comfort and support that we can in that moment, but making sure that we can also offer community resources.
And the more you make them at ease, the more they're going to share. So, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you might meet with someone many times before you actually do an oral history interview, right? They may invite you back 2 weeks later, and I encourage you to go because you're definitely going to hear different stories than the first time that you met them, right? Sometimes that first interaction with someone can be quite stilted as you're just getting to know someone and develop that relationship. And so if you have the opportunity to do multiple interviews, I encourage you to. It'll be a very rich experience.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and then James, you also had another question in the chat. What are the most popular oral history projects that you've been a part of in terms of participation and also that have been viewed online the most?
A good question. The most popular oral history projects that I've been part of. This one is probably the biggest project over so many years that I've been involved in. We're now into year 6 of the project. We got a big social science and humanities research grant to do it. It was shortlisted for a Governor General's award in 2023 and has quite a bit of visibility. And this is the first oral history project that I've created a website for. So I would say this one, definitely. Early on in my career, I also did some work with the histories of women's hockey, looking at a particular team called the Preston Rivulettes. And from that project, I ended up writing a children's book, which is in libraries across Canada. So that actually has had a lot of visibility as well, but in a very different way, written for a very different level. But it was a lot of fun being able to do that. And then over the years, we ended up getting, we applied to Parks Canada to get designation for the arena that they played out of in Ontario. And that happened in 2019. And then in 2022, that team was inducted into the Canada Sports Hall of Fame. So I was involved in all of those things as well. So your oral history work can morph in many different directions, depending on what you want to do with it around advocacy and some of those pieces. So I would say those are the 2 projects that have been the most popular and have had the most reach.
Okay, thanks.
But again, it's really important to think about dissemination right from the beginning. What are you hoping to do with these interviews? What's the purpose and goal of the project that you're working on? And what does the community hope that will come out of it as well?
Then Kevin also had 2 follow-up questions to that. Why and what made those projects so successful? And then also, if you don't have no one else has any other questions, what specific advice would you offer for oral histories as it relates to sport or soccer in particular?
Arrow, if I can just pick up on that, Carly, before you answer. I was really intrigued by some of the things you showed in that, the memory booth, a time map, an audio journey. So I was kind of curious about the different types of tools that you use in an oral history project. And I'm thinking how we can translate those and use similar ones related to sports history, soccer history, etc. So I was curious if you could make a bridge just between some of the things that you did, what works well, and then maybe how that would link to what we would do. Thank you.
Yeah. Returning the stories has become sort of the motto for the oral history work that I do. In the last decade, I've been much less likely and less interested, maybe, which I don't know if I should be saying this as an academic, in writing for academic audiences. Of course, I'm still contributing in that way too. It's what we do. But it's really important to me to be thinking about how to share these stories back with the community. And so if you can have a partnership or a collaboration with a local museum or a local organization and they have similar goals to you, then it makes it so much easier to be able to do that. We got really lucky in 2019 with the development of this cultural center that they were looking for some of these histories to be within their walls and were open to us, contributing and being part of these conversations. And so we had a whole advisory group from the community that came together with us to brainstorm how we can do this and what we can give back. And so this is an ongoing project. We're currently developing 3 different kiosks, like touch screens on top with headphones that you see in museums all the time. It's not a new idea, but we'll have 3 of these, 1 that stays in the garden and 2 that can go out into the community. So again, just having broader reach. And so being innovative and creative and thinking about different ways that you can be sharing these stories back with the community is really important. There's also a number, there's an oral history metadata synthesizer, I believe they're calling it, out of the University of Kentucky, where you can have a searchable interview now online. And so there's a lot of pieces to be thinking about these things too. Like, how can we be sharing the work that we're doing and the interviews that we're doing with researchers and with the community? And there's a lot of software being developed right now to enable us to do that in a more easy way through websites and technology. So there's lots of things to be thinking about within the community. And there seems to be a real connection right now with digital storytelling as well. There are a number of different training centers, Berkeley in the US, there's one in Montreal at Concordia University, around digital storytelling. And this is something I'm really passionate about. Our interviewees have really enjoyed being part of this process and having control over how their story is told and what they get to include in it. You saw Pat's film, it's fun, but it also has some really serious and important histories incorporated as part of it too. I see a question there about specific advice as it relates to soccer. Time is always my advice with oral history. It takes a long time. It does. And it's, you're creating long-term relationships with people. Oral history work is very different than any other type of research work. You are creating relationships, and so it takes time to be able to do this well and to achieve what you want to do with it. But yes, I would love to see more oral. I would love to see more sport history work around soccer and oral history work around soccer. Would be great.
Okay, well, we are getting right about 12:59. So we are going to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us on this session for Oral History Workshop. Dr. Carly Adams did a wonderful job, and hopefully we can work on some more projects, do some more workshops in the future. It seems like it was a very useful presentation for everyone. So we'd just like to go ahead and say thank you all, and we are going to close the session.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. And if you're interested in our 6-week virtual session in May and June, please get in touch with me and I'll share more information.
Thank you so much, Carly.